It's absolutely wonderful to have your company here today, everyone. I'm really delighted to see you all here. This is our Permaculture Education Institute Masterclass for June, and it's actually a special event that we do in collaboration with Local Futures every year, which is Celebrate World Localization Day. And we celebrate all month in collaboration with Local Futures. So this is the fourth event that we've hosted for this month. The first one we did, and I hope many of you were there for that, which was the screening of Ancient Futures, one of Helena's first film. Then we screened Economics of Happiness, which is an award-winning film, also by Helena and the Local Futures team. And then our final film that we screened last Saturday, was Planet Local. Now, since then, Helen has also released 2 new films, which we will be screening for you over the next few weeks or so, and that they are Closer to Home and The Power of Local. So I'm so delighted to have you here with us, Helena, today for this permaculture masterclass. So we've called this masterclass Permaculture and Localization, bringing together the 2 key threads of the work that we do. So before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Gubbi and pay my respects to elders past and present, and invite anyone who's here. We have a wonderful group of people here from around the world. Let us know where you're calling in from. Drop into the chat, open up the chat and start to let us know where you're calling in from. This is also the place that I would love to invite you to be asking questions, and I'll be keeping an eye out for this as we go along. After Helen and I have had a chat for a while, we will open it up for questions, and I would love for you to be part of this conversation. So welcome, Helena. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm very happy to be here and so glad that you're running this program and so happy about our collaboration.
So I'd just like to say a few words of introduction for Helena, because it's such an honor and privilege to have you here with us, Helena. For those of you who have not met Helena before, Helena is an international pioneer of the localization movement. She's been working in this space for decades and leading this conversation in the big picture activism and really exploring what localization is, what it means, and how we can take a step in this direction, and has created an organization called Local Futures. And we will be sharing and have already shared the links to this, to her organization. And there is an enormous, I think you described it last time we spoke, Helena, that it's like you can do a PhD of localization with all the resources that are available in there. Helena is also a recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, and also a Goi Peace Prize Award, and I'm sure many other awards along the way too. So absolutely wonderful to have your company here today. I wonder whether we could begin by just speaking a bit about what is World Localization Day, how did it started, and what are you hoping this will help to activate in the community by hosting this event?
Well, and we decided, because of COVID, actually, to launch something online that could be instantaneously global. We had been working globally for a long time, but we've been doing it by organizing conferences, regional conferences across the world. And we do generally prefer that as a modality because that encourages people from the region to come together. And then we provide a sort of global chorus of voices to explain that worldwide, we are all dependent on 2 systems now. One of them is this living system of Mother Gaia, this infinitely diverse, constantly changing tapestry that is our home. That is essentially every religion, every spiritual tradition teaches us about that inextricable oneness of all life. On the other side, we have a system that went away from those teachings and that rose as a very aggressive and cruel system through slavery and enclosures. And that became over the centuries, a global economic system where traders intervened between our relationships, so that when we were trading in Australia, or even in a small region, in a small town, suddenly the global market was influencing our exchanges, shaping our ultimately our identities too, because it became a force field that promoted one global consumer monoculture. And I guess where we differ a little bit from permaculture is that we arose out of this commitment to support diversity, to support genuine biological and cultural diversity. And that was the foundation in the indigenous culture that I lived and worked in Ladakh or Little Tibet. So our message, as I say, had become very global, and we were very globally active, trying to explain that we have these two systems and that we now really need to choose very consciously and clearly which of those systems we want to support. The top-down, patriarchal, misogynist, monocultural system, or that incredible force of life, that spiritual home of ours. And if we want to be clear about which system we want to support, we need to have clarity about both. So we ended up doing a rather difficult job of trying to explain to people about this global system that was becoming so dominant that on every part of the planet, people's identities and their local economies were being destroyed by that system. So we had various books, films, and so on. And what we loved doing for many years was facilitating people coming together in their region so that leaders in their region would be on a panel and they would be benefiting from the chorus of global voices that we had put together, because we'd been working with people from every continent. But with COVID, we thought, well, we had to cancel at that point. We were doing a big one with favelas in Rio. We were actually working with the new government in Mexico, with the Minister for the Environment. We were doing one in Byron Bay. We were doing our ninth or something in South Korea, another one in Japan. Anyway, we had to cancel all of those. So then we put a lot of effort into creating this big global program, and we launched it as World Localization Day. And it was the main theme, as always, was to celebrate, make visible, and try to garner support for this movement that is growing around the world. And we called it World Localization Day, and we managed to get some quite prominent people, including Jane Goodall and Noam Chomsky, Dalai Lama, various well-known voices, to join in support of this celebration. And we chose June 21st, the solstice, as a way to remember our deep connections to nature. And of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, that also means being out in nature, celebrating in nature. And yeah, and I'm so happy that you, Morag, you've been one of the members celebrating with us now for quite a few years.
Yes, every year since it began, we've been celebrating with you. And you said, some quite well-known voices. Well, they're extraordinarily well-known voices behind this movement of localization. And I wanted to ask you about what would you describe are the key characteristics of the localization movement, and maybe talk a little bit about how you see the permaculture movement aligning with that, and maybe where you see some differences, and how we could, as a permaculture movement, to amplify what we're doing.
Yeah, well, what happens is that we've discovered that almost always the people who are passionate about our work are people who've had experience both of more land-based, community-based ways of living, which means often in the so-called less developed parts of the world, and the sort of center of the urban consumer culture. So people who've actually lived in the consumer culture and have experienced another way of life, which is usually slower, and because it's more community-based, it's more human scale. We would have very often Westerners who would work with us in Ladakh, come back from an hour in the bazaar, and they would say, "Oh, there were 10 people who said hello to me," and they felt so seen as an individual human being. Whereas when we're living in the heart of the urban consumer culture and highly westernized world, we have this tragic situation where we're being pushed into cities, we're crowded on top of each other, and because it's so unnatural, we can't look each other in the eye, say hello. There's just too many, and there's so much anonymity and constant flux and change in this very unnatural way. Excuse me. So the characteristic very often of the people who love our work will be people. Vandana Shiva is one who's been part of our work from the 80s. She's a sort of well-known figure who studied and got a PhD in the West, but grew up in India. Another very close colleague is Manish Jain. He's also Indian, and he was born in India, but grew up in America. And he did very well. He went to Harvard, did well, worked with Goldman Sachs, and worked with the UN. And he became aware that actually what they were doing in this top-down work was very destructive. So not only the financial institutions, but even the UN, so many well-intentioned people without knowing it were bringing in a development which was creating a consumer monoculture. It was destroying land-based ways of living. It was destroying farming, often in the name of helping farming. So he became aware and disillusioned. And as he said, he went back to Rajasthan to learn from his illiterate grandmother. And he became very convinced that we must unlearn the mainstream education we've had to go deeper to understand what real education would look like. And that would mean much more ecologically founded, and that means also more place-based. And I could go on and on about the education. But anyway, he's a close ally, someone named Bayo Akomolafe, who is Nigerian, and similar experience. He was educated.
Fade it up when you're ready.
Can you hear me okay? Because my connection is a bit unstable.
I can hear you fine, but your video stops every now and then. So, but yeah, that's fine.
That's it.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. So there's been a pattern where paradoxically, it's people who've traveled quite a lot and have had quite a lot of international experience, but people who have had not just experience of traveling and just quickly looking superficially, but actually living in a place and experiencing, as it were, both sides. One, where we're more embedded in Gaia, one, where we're more victims of this top-down urban consumer culture. And so we forever have actually encouraged international exchange. We actually encourage that people who want to do something to improve life on this planet should try to have the experience of, as it were, both sides and see it with more conscious eyes, interact with people on both sides of the equation. And in terms of as I said before, one of the differences with permaculture is I knew Bill Mollison very well, and his, passion and vision was how can we regenerate this land that has been killed by inappropriate agriculture? How can we also bring community back to the land? And it was wonderful and, 100% appropriate for Australia. But in the beginning, some of the permaculture people would come to remote places like Ladakh or parts of Africa and quite unconsciously introduce, as it were, an Australian system, often Australian species even. But what I've seen is that the permaculture movement has grown and is I would say one of the most important parts of the worldwide localization movement is probably the, premier place where Westerners have really woken up to the joys of land-based living, to the need for community, and where there has been practice. And what I love about permaculture too is that it's never become horribly commercial. It's a real bottom-up grassroots movement that now, throughout the Western world has really trained up some of the best people and the best activists promoting exactly what we're talking about, which is this rebuilding of deep earth-based relationships and the community fabric, and with a focus on food. And that is for us the absolute center of the localization movement that we're promoting. I'll just quickly say something more about that, and that is that when we look carefully at the big picture, I hope it's become clear in our films that one of the most important things we can do is to shift what is a global food economy away from multiple, more localized food systems. This is for food security, it's for restoring biodiversity, both agricultural diversity, but also wild biodiversity. And so that shift in the food system is absolutely the most central, and it's one that we all need to be supporting with everything that we can.
And I think one of the things that I really like about permaculture is that it essentially is a movement of sharing knowledge and skills and experience and engaging in like a community learning process about what this means in each local context. So it is essentially like an educational movement, I think, as well. And, I've spoken to you before too about this, about the kind of education that we need in the world. I mean, maybe if you could just speak a little bit more to that here, because we've probably got a different group than what heard us speak about this last time. But what kind of education do you feel we really need to be able to amplify the localization message and all of the things that go with that?
Well, I have to say that very important is understanding better the global system. And that's been a very difficult task that we've been carrying out, trying to bring educational materials about that. Because for many years, there was a lot of resistance. There was in the West a feeling that we were moving towards sustainability. And what was happening was that the corporate world was waking up to the terrible environmental impact of the conventional global economy, but they were not looking at the fact that the main problem was that these big banks and big corporations were not able to tend to the earth, were not able to care. They were too big. And it's not because the people inside those corporations were evil. It's not because they intentionally wanted to pervert the environmental movement, but they ended up doing that. And part of the process was that in the era of globalization from the 80s, giant industries were pressuring governments to give them more freedom to go anywhere on the planet they wanted to. They could move in and out. Free trade meant that they had freedom to move, that they could enter any country, any economy without any restrictions, and there would be no rules for them. And that's they were negotiating treaties with governments, giving them that freedom. And as they did so, they were, of course, destroying local businesses, they were destroying the local economy, and most frighteningly, they were destroying small-scale agriculture worldwide. And as they moved from the West to employ people in India or China, big industry left Australia, left America, left Sweden, and sometimes the rivers were cleaned up and the air was cleaner. And then there was the dominant narrative saying, look, sustainability, we're becoming de-linked from energy increasing with GDP, we're becoming cleaner. And it was all a lie, because our CO2 emissions were now going to China. Now, yes, if you measured CO2 emissions just within Australian boundaries or American, then our emissions were going down, and we were no longer consuming more and more energy to produce things within our own countries. But of course, as those factories moved elsewhere, our footprint was getting bigger, because they were often producing in a very polluting way, and then everything we needed was being transported across the world. And not even that, worse than that, was that in order to make corporations wealthier, we were now locked into a system where governments were importing and exporting the same product. So instead of consuming our own butter, it was being shipped across the world while we imported butter. Instead of consuming our own beef, it was being sent across the world, and we imported beef from elsewhere. And sometimes the import and export was even between the same countries, because each time global traders made money. This is truly insane. And actually, looking at global trade, and which is the center of globalization, and being clear about that is one of the strongest motivations for people to say, wow, I can actually do something by supporting a permaculture inspired local food system. I can do something about climate change. I can reduce the mountains of plastic. I can regenerate biodiversity, including wild biodiversity. And I can rebuild the community fabric, which is one of the most healing things we can do to help human beings not just connect to nature, but in the process becoming productive in a way that in most of the things we do, we don't have the satisfaction of seeing. Most of our jobs now are locked into this long distance economy. We don't have the benefit and the joy of seeing the smile on people's faces, who've tasted our tomatoes or who love the food we're growing. We don't have that, those benefits. So the one of the most important educational bits is to understand and to teach more about the global system in contrast with localized systems. And when we share education about the localized systems, we have so many wonderful stories to tell. We have so much good news to report. Now, that news comes from small-scale initiatives. And guess what? One of our educational messages has to be small is beautiful. And we should remind everyone about the wisdom of Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful. He was an economist, high profile, very respected in the mainstream. He was actually the head of the coal board in the UK, a German economist. He ended up going to Burma in the 60s, and he experienced what I experienced in Ladakh, a culture where there was no poverty, there was no unemployment, and he encountered the happiest, most peaceful, joyous people he had ever met. So he had to rethink his whole foundational view of economics. And he did that with a deep spiritual wisdom, spiritual, profound wisdom. Now, that book is something that all of you should be familiar with, and it's a book that you should try to spread the word about, because mainstream economics did not want to hear. Mainstream economics has gone from myth to myth and become more and more destructive. And we need to know that. We need to be clear that it's become a bit of a question of life or death now. One system inadvertently is promoting a death economy. As we destroy biodiversity, as we destroy cultural diversity, we are destroying biodiversity. And I think the death of biodiversity, most people will recognize, is the death of life. And on the other side, the localization movement is about exactly the opposite. And very important message as part of the education is also that the dominant path is clearly responsible for epidemics of depression, suicide, addiction, other disorders, and even suicide, particularly among young people. Now, in order to see that, you have to look at the big picture. You have to actually actively put the pieces together, because the mainstream media, mainstream academia does not teach this, because it's funded by big business. Now, that makes those big businesses sound really evil. And I would say, as a structure, it is evil that we have ended up allowing for profit giant monopolies that do not pay tax to suddenly have no rules, no restrictions, and be able to freely move in and out of all our countries. That is ending up in an evil impact. But the people inside those corporations don't see the bigger picture, don't see the damage they're doing. And it's up to us to look at that and to be willing to talk about it. And
Helena, I've got lots of questions for you that are coming up as you're going along. I can see someone's got their hand up. We'll come to your questions soon. So, Bhavna, I do see you. I wanted to ask you about the global economy and this system that you're describing. Firstly, how does a linguist become so fluent in global economics, what's happening, and who were your mentors and where did you learn about this? That's one question. The other question is, apart from playing a different set of rules and being part of the local movement and the permaculture movement and speaking about it, what else can we be doing to help to dismantle it? Like, because sometimes I think, and many people who are here part of this would agree, like, it just seems something that's over there, something that we can't touch, something we can't do anything about. It's this force beyond our impact, and we'll just have to burrow away and do our little thing over here. I really feel like there's got to be more that we feel enabled to do. And what would you suggest that be? Hang on, you're muted. Sorry, Helena. Oh, hang on a tick, just a minute. Do you want to try now?
No, okay. I put it on to have a little sneeze and a bit of a cough.
You got stuck off. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So well, how does a linguist become, and I would say I am an expert on the global economy, and I am an expert on local economies. And I say to people, if you want to become an expert in this, the last thing you should do is study economics. Economics is founded on assumptions about biology, about anthropology, about human nature, and those assumptions are wrong. It is outrageous that in this, sometimes masquerading as a science, that in this field that people are getting away with promoting still ideas also of efficiencies of scale, of supply and demand. It is utterly outrageous that people are being trained into going along with these myths. Nothing of the sort is happening now. It is so outrageous that these monopolies are being not only free of tax and free of regulations, but also subsidized. Our taxes are used to subsidize them still. they grew in such a massive way because of heavy government subsidies for global infrastructure, for the ever bigger ports, the ever bigger airports, ever straighter superhighways. Those highways were never meant for us. They've always been meant for long distance traders. And for the global traders, the shifting the entire global population into bigger and bigger mega cities is one of the consequences. So our governments have not only built up that global infrastructure, but supported the rise of cities that have taken the water from where it's needed to feed a country, that have taken energy to feed corporate profits while essentially starving their own people. So it's so absolutely essential that we have the big picture to understand this. And I think very, very importantly, have enough, I hope, experience, common sense to really empathize with people who are in those corporations who honestly have not been given the big picture and who are on a daily basis now more and more surrounded by the most wonderful language. They're more and more embedded in a language of supporting biodiversity, supporting the poor, inclusivity, justice. Every positive word you can think of is being used by big business as a giant machine to promote what they do as benefiting the planet. And once you realize that the budget of many big corporations in creating the propaganda, the narrative, the budget for that is often bigger than the budget for production. And so it's become a monstrous propaganda machine that then also, as giant corporations buy up the giant media corporations, it's not just Murdoch, it's a process of merging of bigger and bigger media corporations linked to the financial casino, linked to the agricultural, fewer and fewer companies owning the seeds that are used across the entire world. And of course, we know the role of Monsanto, but we often have not been given the bigger picture to then also understand how and why it is that one of the most important things we can do is to raise awareness. So in my case, as a linguist, as I said, like Schumacher, I had a very similar experience, but the difference was that I spoke the language fluently and I stayed in Ladakh and I witnessed year by year the change brought in by support for ultimately a global system. It was through the Indian government. And as the Indian government started subsidizing and supporting DDT, for instance, was brought in and promoted, even though it was outlawed in the West. And this was going on for a long, long time in the Third World. I mean, this still is. Places are still being built with asbestos today in the so-called Third World. And so there's such a lack of information there. And again, even the government leaders who do this work, they're not evil people, but they don't have the information. They've been learned to sort of poo-poo these emotional environmentalists who are trying to stop growth. So a holistic picture where we can share that actually this is not just about the environment. People around the world are getting poorer. And this is happening even in China and India, that as the economy grows in the hands of global banks and corporations, where our governments are now becoming little puppets to them, the growth means that the vast majority of people are getting poorer. You and I are getting poorer. In a certain way, even the CEO of Exxon and the CEO of Mobil, as they were running like crazy to stay on top, when they knew there was going to be that mega merger, because that's what's going on in this game of giants, the big get bigger and bigger and bigger. And every time you have a merger, there's going to be one CEO instead of two. So we have a strong argument to get them also to step back and look at what's happening. Generally speaking, so I see also comment here saying, isn't it a bit simplistic to say that all mainstream economists and others have no overview? Of course, it's simplistic. I'm making a very broad generalization, but I'm afraid that I'm right in the vast majority of cases. And I also know that from having worked with economists, and you were asking who some of them were that I'd worked with. Herman Daly was a friend, and he was an economist who started questioning this, an American, quite well-known economist. And he even went into the World Bank to try to get this bigger picture out. And he was seeing the impact of globalization and global trade treaties. And he stayed for, I think it might have been 2 years, and left very disheartened, gave up on changing mainstream economic thinking. I worked with Richard Douthwaite, another trained economist, English economist. He wrote a book called The Growth Illusion, where he pointed out that as the economy was growing, people were getting poorer. GDP was going up, but the average person in Britain was getting poorer. And unfortunately, he has died now. I also collaborated with an economist named Juliet Schor, an American economist, who wrote a book called The Overworked American. At that time, I think when she started, she was at Harvard. Later, she ended up at a less well-known university. But in that book, she was saying essentially the same thing. As the economy has been growing over the last 3 decades, I think it was from roughly 65 to 95, the average American is having to work 1 month more per year to stay in place. Another economist, again American, I've worked very closely with, is David Korten. And he wrote a book called When Corporations Rule the World. He had taught at Harvard, taught at Stanford. I think he graduated from Harvard. He taught at both. He worked for USAID. He had been trained into economics. He was convinced about it. And he went to Southeast Asia to teach this magic formula of economics to help these poor people in Southeast Asia benefit from this American model. Living in Southeast Asia, seeing with his own eyes what was happening, he wrote the book, When Corporations Rule the World. He became aware that he was going in a hideously wrong direction. And so, what I have witnessed is that Schumacher that book was published in the early 70s. At that point, this new form of corporate empire had not grown so powerful. So his book got out widely. The others I've mentioned, most people haven't heard of, and most economists don't hear about. And economists today don't get to hear about Schumacher at all in their training. So I know it's a general statement. It can sound simplistic. Everything I'm saying can sound very simplistic because by trying to outline the big picture, inevitably, we can't go into the same specific detail. So we have to understand that there is a very unattractive part of what I'm saying, that it sounds so simplistic, so general, and many people will say, well, it can't really be true, can it?
But I think that's the thing. It's so surprising, isn't it? When you tell people about insane trade, about how as much butter gets flown from Britain to New Zealand as what goes back the other way, like that could not be possible. Like you point to things and say it in a way that is so clear that it does sound insane. How could anyone possibly be doing this? And, it is extraordinarily unthinkable that we could be in this state, that someone doesn't just go, look, come on, guys, this is not working. Let's do something. We know there's a climate emergency. We know there's a biodiversity. We know that we don't want to be using so much fossil fuels. Let's just kind of use our own stuff. Because I think what you're describing is there's no central thing organizing all this. It's simply these trade agreements, and that's the organizing pattern.
Yes, I would say it's a little bit more than that. Now, after the Second World War, the well-intentioned leaders sat around this table at Bretton Woods in America, and they were now convinced that to prevent another depression and another world war, they needed to, what they believed was harmonize, integrate economics across the world. And so there was a lot of good intention that went into rolling out the red carpet for the Rockefellers, for giant corporations, mainly at that point, Western, certainly, and a lot of them American. And America had sort of won, and now this expansion across the world, and they sort of conquered Japan and Korea. They became sort of colonies to become these new techno-modern industrial economies with a lot of pressure from America. So there was a concerted effort involving governments and setting up one World Bank and one International Monetary Fund was part of that process. But what was also set up was something called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, it was the three that worked together in a sort of concerted way to push, and someone pointed out that countries that have tried to stand up against this have often met with tragic consequences. And we know, we've learned enough about CIA infiltration in South America and so on. So there has also been military clout behind it. And even today, I'm afraid that US intelligence is one of the big drivers. But I was invited to give a seminar on localization to the headquarters of intelligence in America. And I realized that there too, and I didn't go, I knew they would know everything we were up to. So I said I would do a seminar. I didn't want to go there. And this was actually, for some reason, it was naval intelligence, and they're based in Rhode Island. But I did a 3-hour seminar on localization with admirals and, sort of about 30, 40 high-level people. Interestingly enough, a lot of women in US intelligence. Again, my impression, first of all, they were very keen to hear that I believed that the internet, 3D printing, the mobile phone, that this international communications infrastructure and this general rise of technology was helpful to localization. I kept giving my reasons why not. I'm seeing the opposite effect. I'm seeing that it has supported this financial casino that is able to allow investors to sit in New York or even in Mongolia. I mean, I've seen young boys put on their pinstripe suits and go to their little financial casino, sit in front of a computer, playing games, and they're playing games with our lives. Those long distance investments, whether from young boys in Mongolia or from investors on Wall Street, are actually weapons of mass destruction because they cannot see the impact. Remember in 2008, we were awakened to the fact that those boys had been training in envelopes of mortgages, of people's lives. They had no idea where they were, what their names were, nothing. And they were destroying the lives of millions of people. Everyone in the world knew we needed to regulate this industry. We needed to regulate those banks. But we were told, sorry, Obama said to the world, sorry, too big to fail, too big to fail. Now, that's the myth that now has penetrated down to the environmental movement. So in the environmental movement, there are people who believe that governments can't do anything to shift the economy to support life, essentially, to support healing the environment, providing meaningful livelihoods linked to sustaining life on Earth. Can't do that because they'll be so poor. There'll be so much poverty. There'll be so much breakdown. This is not true. But even down to the level of professors of environmental studies, professors who are writing books about degrowth, voluntary simplicity, they actually believe that there's no point talking about that global stuff because governments can't do anything. And it's absolutely not true. In other words, what's not true is that it would need to entail some sudden poverty in your country. So there's too much actually probably to go into, but I would urge people to sign up for our course, which I want to invite Morag also to teach on. We are going to do a course on all of this because I wanted to tell you also about modern monetary theory, and just quickly to tell you that in modern monetary theory, one of the advisors to Bernie Sanders, was exposing him to this thinking from economists who are saying it is absolutely crazy that governments are allowing essentially private banks, to print money as a debt to government. There is no real shortage of money. Money is not the issue, but we are now being pushed into this insanity of governments obeying the rules of private banks and starving their own people literally, while continuing to allow huge amounts of money to make those billionaires who already have 100 billion get richer. When are we going to have a wake up where people say there is something very wrong here? On my screen every day, I hear about people who have 100 billion, and around me, I'm seeing people, highly educated professors, doctors, nurses, teachers, who are struggling to pay the mortgage. I know that the young generation now really has a very, very, bleak future where the jobs available are cutthroat in urban centers and hard to come by. And where the jobs are, the housing is far too expensive. Most of them can't even dream of owning their own home now. What is happening? We need that big picture, and we need a lot of women who are more connected to people, who are more concerned about the epidemic of depression, who are more aware of the death of ecosystems, and who want to do something. And it's and I wanted to say, someone mentioned Kate Rayworth, and she's quite well known, but she also doesn't dare to take on the big picture. So I'm very glad, her basic message is very important, but it's not enough. I've tried to talk to her about it, but there are, a lot of people now who either shy away from the big picture because they feel that we can't do anything about it. As I said, I do know a lot of my dear friends, even, as I say, even in the degrowth movement and so on, and they somehow, not looking clearly enough at the big picture, believe it's not possible for governments to do anything. So what we do need for sure is an international movement, but also I just want to come back, I know I've been talking for a very long time now, but I just want to come back to saying that it's vital that we not only speak the truth about that bigger, very dark picture about the global economic system, but it's very, very important that we do everything we can to learn enough about the localization initiatives that are there, to make the voices in that movement more visible, to hold up the truth about the benefits we can see on a small scale. And remember, one of the challenges there, which is very hard for men often, is to understand that many small is much more powerful than one big, much richer, much more powerful. Ultimately, people talk about the mosquitoes and the elephant, but just think about if you have 1,000 acres, if you divide that up into even smaller than 100-acre farms, 50-acre farms, and you have more people on the land tending to what's needed to have highly diversified production, including animals in the cycle, from those 1,000 acres, you would be able to get far, far greater productivity. So don't believe the myth that we're too many people now to go back to the land. We are too many people now to drive every human being away from the land into giant cities where they're forced to consume more water, more energy, more just in transport miles, more destruction of the biosphere. We need to prevent mega urbanization. We need to even start supporting some of those people to leave the cities. But the high priority is to support those who are on the land already and to help diversify.
And I think this is where permaculture links in with what you're talking about, because it's the kind of education that helps us to do that. It helps us to understand how we can take those parcels of land and to be caring for people, caring for country, and restoring forests and waterways, and be looking at the multiple dimensions. So I think this is where, the big picture localization movement and permaculture come together in this beautiful way. There's so many questions that are starting to come up there in the chat and comments as well. One of the questions that I saw earlier was, so if we have this globalizing movement that's so powerful, how is it possible to go back? I think maybe you've started to talk about that already. There was another question early on about, are there any countries that are not engaging in this global trade, and are they setting some different kind of standards that we can be looking to and uplifting as well? So maybe we can start with those two, and then we'll go to Bhavna, and then anyone else wants to drop in any questions or like to raise up your hand, please take this moment to do that.
No, at the moment, I don't know of any countries that are not joining this. I mean, potentially in a limited way, North Korea, I don't know. But within the, even small countries like Bhutan, that, I think we had a bit of an influence there. They stayed out of the WTO, but their economic framing is still far too mainstream. But several of my colleagues and so on are working there, and we're hoping that that small country can be a bit of a model. It's not looking so hopeful, and that's because one of the main drivers is psychological, what I call psychological pollution and manipulation. So in Bhutan, as in Ladakh and in many, we worked in Bhutan over a 5-year period, so we know it quite well, and it was completely parallel to what happened in Ladakh. And that is, the propaganda is images of people in the West who seem to do no work, because traditional people think of work as being physical work, moving their bodies, using their bodies. And here are these people who just sit in front of a screen, push a few buttons, and they're so nice and clean, and they've got all these amazing things, these cars and magical, amazing consumer product. And what do we have? We have this simple life and we're poor, and the narrative makes them seem stupid and backward, because the educational message also is literally, often in the school books, we have to get these ignorant farmers off the land into the city, and the way to get a job there is to get an education, and then you too can become an engineer or doctor. So there is quite a lot behind all this, what's going on, because I witnessed even in Sweden how this narrative affects young people, and how it's affecting even young people living in eco-villages, which generally have been, created by Westerners who really wanted to live differently. But the propaganda machine, with the help of the screen, is so powerful that we can do, we can make a difference, as Morag has done also with a daughter who has lived in a community and who's now becoming a leader. But Morag will also be able to tell you just how difficult it is to work against those pressures. And I think so this, really my message is, we need to be as informed as we can be and not shy away from seeing the difficulties. But the main difficulty is what's in our minds. The difficulty is not practical. There is not a natural limit of money. There is a natural limit of resources, which is why we must come back to nurture the real economy, the resources we depend on. And I want to answer that question. I see here someone saying, why is oat milk from Sweden cheaper in New Zealand than oat milk made in New Zealand? I forgot to mention, this is part of the magic formula that's happening. These completely false prices that destroy the local economy. This happened when I first started talking about local food in Australia in 1999. I remember at Ceres in Melbourne, they became very interested and they started taking more initiative to grow more food there. And the next year when I came back, they had discovered that it wasn't possible to buy a cereal with organic wheat grown in Australia. You could buy an organic cereal in England made with organic wheat from Australia, but you couldn't find it here in Australia. Now, this is one of millions upon millions of examples how on a daily basis the prices are destroying the local economy. And it's nothing to do with water availability. It's everything to do with manipulation from a financial casino that's extracting wealth to the top. And of course, when you hear this, you can think, well, oh, how are we going to get rid of the financial casino? How are we going to? It sounds so big, it sounds so difficult.
Because I realize we've come to the end of our time, but there's a couple of questions we should really attend to before we close up. There's a question in here too from John saying, how can I change my mind? Like how do we make this change that we need? Gosh, there's lots of different questions that are coming up.
Can I just quickly respond then too, because I see someone mentioned that Rutger Bregman is encouraging people to do small groups where they talk to each other. That's what I recommend. That's how you can change your mind, and that's how you can combine the big picture and doing something that is enjoyable. Because as you connect with like-minded people, just that process of how can we look at this, what might we do about it, is a very, very powerful and essential for doing this process. So it's actually part of the localization path that you connect more with like-minded people near where you live. You start building bonds of support also. So you actually start building that fabric of interdependence that is what allowed us to evolve. We would not be here as human beings if we hadn't had that local interdependence, and we've lost that. So the path forward for looking at the bigger picture and for gaining far greater joy and a sense of empowerment is those local groups.
And just to add in the permaculture flavor on that too, one thing that I've noticed a lot in starting up things like Northeast Street City Farm and various community gardens is when people come together, they're working together side by side and their conversations happen. And then when you get together over the cup of tea while you're having a break, you go deeper. And it's a really easy place to start conversations like this because you're talking about local food, you're talking about reconnecting with place, and you're learning the skills to do this localization work. So I really think they're a fabulous place to do that. There's two people with their hands up. Helena, do you have a moment to stick around and answer these two questions? Thank you very much. And please, everyone, stay here for the questions too, if you can, because I did want to round up by letting Helena share the resources that she has available so that you can use those to help to get conversations happening. So we'll go first to Susan, if you'd like to open up. Thank you very much.
Hi, listen, Morag, as usual, fabulous Zoom. And what an amazing woman Helena is. And thank you. You seem to know so much about so many things. And one thing that, I'm not questioning anything you've said so far because I completely agree with both of you. One thing I'm noticing, I think, Morag, you're in Tyro, yeah? In Queensland? You might
in Crystal Waters Permaculture Village.
Oh, you're up at Crystal Waters. Okay, so have you noticed the sky and the chemtrails and all of that. And I've been a Permie for 32 years. I did my design certificate in 1992. So, yeah, the thing is, we can all go out and do our, food forests and our lovely guilds and all of that. But these chemicals are so severe that I don't know if anyone's had any direct, testing on, wonderful growth and all of that, but they're full of chemicals. Has anyone in the Permi, environment really looked into that? What's happening now?
I'm not sure about that. Thanks, Sue. I wonder, Helena, whether you have any comment.
Well, yes, I have. There is a fact that governments have been experimenting with manipulating the climate, and it goes a long way back. And it's quite official, seeding for rain and so on. And I think, unfortunately, with the help of intelligence, it has been used also as a weapon. And apparently there was an attempt at a treaty a long time ago to prevent that, as there have been experiments with viruses and bacteria to create disease as a weapon. However, I do not believe that most governments are involved in trying to consciously harm us or harm people with these crazy experiments that are very dangerous. What I do think has happened is that the science has been moving rapidly with the help of big funding from big business, and the testing has become more irresponsible, more speedy, and that it's part of the bigger picture to see this delinking of any societal protection. The rules and regulations that should protect the environment, should protect our health, are now not in the hands of society. They're mainly in the hands of big business, and big business is moving blindly in a direction that's very frightening. So there is, I've heard that there is also a spraying going on in the stratosphere to try to shield the earth from the sun, and that there's, people again who believe that through our limited knowledge that we can actually reduce climate change in ways that should be open up to society. There should be numerous scientists. Society should know what's going on, but too much is happening in secrecy. But I think there are a lot of people who believe that chemtrails are a way of poisoning us and, killing us. And I absolutely don't believe that. I don't think that that's a motivation, but I do think that the unrestricted use of major technologies and chemicals is a very frightening part of the picture.
Claudia, can I go to you now?
Thanks for organising this. So Helena, thank you so much. It's really, really interesting listening to you. I have a question about Sweden, where you're from. I live in Uppsala, and I'm part of the transition towns movement and the permaculture movement, and study circles, as you're talking about, a very important way of life here. But I'm just wondering, so I'm originally from the UK, and I've been involved in transition towns and permaculture for many years. And I'm just wondering if you might be able to shine a light on why is it so difficult in Sweden for people to embrace things like permaculture and transition towns, which I think is a very good way to move forward in line with the things that you're talking about, to get people going back and growing food in their gardens. For example, in England, 80% of primary schools have a school garden, and in Sweden, in Uppsala, only one, and the local municipality won't allow any more.
Oh, I'd love to see that statistic about 80% having a garden. I doubt that. That would be wonderful. But I'm sure there are more. And I do Yeah, this sounds far, far too arrogant, but sometimes in local futures we say, how can it be that there is so little in Scandinavia? And yet, we have been far more active in UK, England, UK, America, Australia, and even in the Czech Republic and in Korea, in Japan. And we've done very little in Scandinavia. And then we say, could it have anything to do with that? I really doubt it. But we definitely are aware that we haven't done very much there. And I would urge you to add to the transition town and permaculture message the message that we have. What is happening in England for sure is that the transition town movement has been waning. And so there was much more activity. We live in Totnes also. And so I knew Rob when he started Transition Town as well, very well. And at that time, it was all about peak oil and climate change. It wasn't about, and still isn't enough about this message that please wake up to the fact that our children now think they can't get a job and are not going to have their own home. Please wake up to this bigger picture. It's not just about climate change as something separate from us. And peak oil, at the time, I mentioned Richard Douthwaite earlier, this economist I work closely with, he was also very taken with peak oil. I was alone in that I had so much global experience and I was studying the global economy, which, by the way, I also did with a group of 40 scientists, right? Vandana Shiva was part of it in a forum that I helped to set up. So we were studying the global process from all around the world. And we were more and more aware that the economy did not rely on any natural limits of money. It had been delinked from resources, delinked from gold, even delinked from the dollar. And so peak oil was all about how, it's becoming harder to excavate. It's going to become more expensive. It's totally going to change society. And I was saying, please look at the global picture and help people understand that better. I'm very skeptical about whether peak oil is going to happen. As it turns out, I was right. I don't want to, unfortunately, I was right, because if their predictions had been true, it would have been fabulous. But they weren't aware enough, and they still aren't. I mean, now I'm just back in Totnes, and I hope, Rob has now joined our World Localization Day and spoke at our summit this last September, and they are now actually talking more about the economy and hopefully bringing in the truth about what that means for middle-class people, even in Sweden. And I'm shocked, I can tell you, having grown up in Sweden, at the techno love in Sweden and what's happened. It's very hard to understand. We have a deep, deep nature-based tradition that has been kept alive in so many of our traditions. And but I would definitely say it will help if we move away from sounding like this is about the environment out there. This is about us. And we try to put the picture together for people who are struggling too much and feel they don't have the time. And in Sweden, in fact, one of my close colleagues is Eva Henje. She's a neuroscientist, and she's in Sweden, and she's very aware of this epidemic of depression on young people. She's been doing research that would also be very helpful to spread the word about.
Yeah. Just before we go to you, Denise, there was a question from Martha earlier around the relocalization of fibers for fabric, for clothing. So we talk about relocalization of food, but have you explored or seen anything around this relocalization of clothing?
Yeah. Yes. Again, as with everything in this movement, led by women, I'm familiar of several initiatives to try to come back. So there's a Local Textile. I'm trying to think if is that actually in Sweden. But anyway, there are several initiatives around the world to do that. And they're very important. But if you don't yet have a leaning, I would urge you to focus on food first. We need to keep in mind that building the lifeboats of food security is more strategic. And just please remember that human beings need to eat food about 3 times a day. Please remember that if we have serious crises, we'll all be able to manage with the clothing we have. We'll all be able to manage even with the buildings. And we've seen it after Fukushima. We've seen it in many crises, even if it means going to the church buildings or to the... But where will the food come from? If in your area there is no food grown, in the Middle East, you'll be eating oil. In parts of Australia, you'll be eating cotton. I mean, I had, toxic cotton. So, do remember that restoring this decentralizing, diversifying local food movement to provide the security is far more urgently needed. And again, that's why it's the more strategic lever. But I cherish and value and want to make more visible the women who are also trying to bring back natural fiber and who are aware of the need to move away from the toxic materials. But I would say in all of that, once we see the bigger picture, it would be probably better to urge people to only buy secondhand and to try to limit the consumption, change the fashion, to just secondhand, and change the encourage more young people to engage in sewing, making their own fashion. There are projects like that as well.
Let's go to the topic of what resources have you got for people to share out into the world so that they can start hosting these conversations, because it is hard to host this when you don't have the knowledge yourself, whereas you have the resources that people can grab and share and share and share and host conversations around that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we do. We have several films. We have also shorter films, sort of 5-minute animations. We're putting out more. There's going to be a new animation coming out very soon. And as Morag mentioned, two new other films. And we are getting very good feedback from young people. In this latest Closer to Home, we deal a little bit more with the whole depression and anxiety side of things. And there are young people who've, written back saying how they agree with every word and how they're very grateful for it. And the key is that we need to be activists in spreading these materials, including those books I mentioned from those other economies, because it's strangled. We are shadow banned by Facebook. The dominant communication system on the social media and mainstream media do not want this bigger picture out. So we have to be actively helping to share it. And there's also this wonderful benefit of doing it in community groups. So remember that, changing the I to a we, so that together, ideally, my favorite picture is that you have intergenerational groups where together they watch these films and have discussions and start identifying the initiatives near them that they might support, or start identifying the possibilities of maybe setting up a farmers market. Farmers markets is one of the most strategic technologies for revitalizing local food movements. And they can help support multiple small producers at the same time. And yeah, there's a lot more to say about that. Please look at our website. We even have a comic book, which I think is up online now, which was actually made for Ladakis, but it's a tool that could be used all over the world. We now are also sharing in The Power of Local, this film that's coming out now, along with Closer to Home, case studies around the world, examples of the types of things that are happening. So again, on our website, lots of tools. Write to us. We have now a network all over the world. So there are also initiatives possibly in your area that you might want to connect to that we know about.
If someone wanted to start up a localization group and access this material, is there a way that they can kind of let you know that they're doing that and be part of your network? How do they do that?
Well, one of the best and easiest thing would be to sign up to World Localization Day and start, with some kind of event that you want to join up with that celebration from around the world. But in other ways too, we are going to be setting up a bit more of a formula for this. At the moment, we are a relatively small team, and we do spend quite a lot of time responding to people who write to us, and we're not going to be able to do that in such a personal way. But if you write to us now, you will get a personal response from someone in Local Futures who will, try to help you and advise you. And we are going to be setting up probably something a little bit more formalized.
Wonderful. I've shared the link to Helena's website in the chat, localfutures.org. So and I'll also be sending out the replay to this masterclass, as well as all the chat, because there's some great resources in there. And I'll also send out direct links to the films and the books that Helena has to share. And you know where to find me. We are hosting conversations all the time, from film clubs to masterclasses to the courses that we run, to all the different things, and encourage you to stay in touch with us too, and to really bring these conversations alive in this space. We host several conversations each month, and we'd love to have your company. So thank you so much, Helena, for being here. A really rich conversation spanning a huge amount of content. And I feel like we've just scratched the surface. And I think what we should really make sure is that the course that you're talking about starting up, we let everyone know here about that, because there's a few people saying, how do I find out more? How do I dive more deeply? And also just to let you know, Helena, that all those books that you talked about are embedded within the permaculture course that I run, and all of your resources are too, because I right at the very beginning to try and set the context of why we're doing permaculture and what's that bigger picture. So, that to me is so important, a part of what permaculture is, and why we're doing it, and how we can really make an impact with it.
I also want to say one final thing, which again will be a bit controversial. But that is, I'm wary of the way that people talk too much about being the change. So I want to urge all of you to realize that right now, in terms of what's happening in the world, we would rather that you help to raise awareness and get a bit of a wake-up happening, so that there might be more community initiatives in your area, rather than spending time perhaps driving to the other side of the town to buy local organic milk in non-plastic bottles. We have been faced with this issue forever. Ever since we started this work, we've seen these unbelievably difficult choices where it's impossible as an individual, when we're in this system now, to be that perfect, be the change. I can't be a community-based ecological culture. I can't be that on my own. So I want you to realize that it is not hypocritical for you to share. I saw the discussion about plastics, and I hope people know about Our Stolen Future, which was a very important study, huge study that came out at least 20 years ago. It was squashed because it showed that plastics are having horrific effect on our health. So please look at Our Stolen Future and share the word about that, not then to point the finger to your neighbor or your friends who might be putting a bit of plastic on something. I'm still using plastic containers for things. I just now carried things back when I was traveling in plastic bags, because it is extremely difficult to do exactly the right thing. And so we all have to be compassionate and kind to ourselves and to others who are not now practicing, what is becoming a type of dogma among some people. And remember, if you manage to do without any plastic at all, you are still not going to have the joy and the health and the, what we all deserve as human beings. So you might be spending too much of your time either feeling guilty But by the way, that's another reason I'm saying this. What's happening is that people have this huge pressure to, for instance, not drive their car. Because now we've been told by climate pundits that we don't care and we're driving up climate change and we shouldn't be driving our car. We should never get into an airplane. Now, I've said for 40 years in Europe, I kept explaining, I don't believe in this personal modeling, in this individual being the change. If I go to America and tell people don't drive your car, it's like saying cut your legs off, don't have a job, don't, because they're living in towns that have been shaped around the car. They're now locked in Sweden already decades ago. You couldn't get on a bus if you didn't have a mobile phone. So, these are some of the reasons why people are doing things that they don't necessarily want to do. So we have to be very kind and compassionate to others in our families and people and to ourselves, and realize what is the most strategic way I can spend my limited time. We have to start with the understanding that we all have very limited time, and that actually doing the things is not what I'm talking about. It's the most important activism. The most important activism is sharing the big picture and organizing a film showing linked to a celebration of local food can be a wonderful celebratory event, even as you all look at that bigger picture and realizing that coming together to share the big picture can be combined with celebration, with meditation, walking in nature, doing a DIY vision quest, singing together, which is a vitally important thing to do, singing, chanting in circle, just sitting in circle and having a meaningful conversation where we talk about our deepest feelings is a healing, and it's part of localization. So I did want people to realize that we want to leave everybody with 5 key words. The first one is reconnect. The second one is, having reconnected with others, is rethink together, and then be willing to resist and renew. So the resistance is be willing to say, I'm going to say no to this. I'm not scared to speak about this. And again, as a group effort, there's a lot you can do. And the final word is rejoice. Rejoice, and rejoicing on a daily basis, allowing yourself to treasure and take joy in how much is still functioning. Remembering that we hear so much gloom and doom, and I know you might think I've added to it, but actually what I hope I've done is to give you a tool to see that all that stuff that's horrible is connected, and focusing on the connected part of it gives us a powerful tool for making change literally in a million ways through central strategic strategies. And I haven't spoken now about the sort of policy change we need, but again, it's a collaborative one. We are arguing to our governments, we want you to get back around the tables where you were negotiating away your right to protect your environment and your citizen. You get back to the tables with civic society at your side, civic society at the table, to now talk to other government leaders. How are we going to collectively take back the power from this financial casino and corporate empire? How are we now going to be able to tell our citizens that we are protecting their health, the health of their environment, their jobs? So thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you, Morag, and your network, and really hope to stay in touch.
Thank you,
and
Helena.
I know I'll see you soon.
Yes, I'll see you soon.
I'll see you right here in this house.
Yes, wonderful. Look forward to the conversations there. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Helena. It's just been an absolute delight having this conversation today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.